Welcome to Module 205B on Service and Service Equipments for a Single Dwelling. Within this module, we're going to be going over 5 different objectives. We're going to start with terminology, so it's more of a review of the terminology that we looked at in the last module, and then we're going to go into the metering requirements themselves. In the second video, we're going to deal with service protection and control equipment, how to place them, where to place them, what to think about, as well as looking at overhead services and the specifics with underground services. So let's take a quick look at reviewing our terminologies. The first term we're going to review is what is the supply service. This is the conductor that goes from the transformer down to the point of attachment at the house, whether it's an overhead service or an underground service, and is completely maintained by the utility company. After the supply service, we have the consumer service. So from the point of attachment at the supply all the way down through our system to the service box, that is all considered to be the consumer service. And an overhead service, like you see here, it will include the raceway, the service head, the meter base, as well as the service box. The service box is defined as the first point that has both a disconnect as well as an overcurrent device. The service head is a device used on overhead services to protect the service raceway and the service equipment from any penetrating water due to weather. The point of attachment is the location where the supply service and the consumer service meet and are connected together, and on an overhead service, it's usually the same place where it's connected to the building. Our service box, once again, needs to have two things. It needs to have overcurrent protection and it needs to have a form of disconnect. So it's the top part of the panel. Or we could also use something like a fused disconnect in order to facilitate the same purpose. The panel board is the circuit breaker compartment. So usually this is the second half of our combination panel, so the lower half of the panel, or it could be a separate panel or a sub-panel within the house. If your house has a secondary panel inside the garage or maybe a secondary panel inside the basement, these are both considered to be part of the panel board. Now that we've gone through our terminology, let's look at some of the metering requirements that we have depending on the type of service we're going to build. Rule 6.402 puts out the conditions of what kind of metering system that we can have. And we have a choice between cold sequence metering and hot sequence metering. Cold sequence metering is something that is typically used on commercial services. Rule 6.402 sub-rule 2 states two different conditions. The first condition is if the service is over 200 amps, we need to use cold sequence metering. The second condition is if it is over 300 volts, we also need to use cold sequence metering. The idea behind this is that the incident energy, if the voltage is sufficiently high or the current is sufficiently high, is dangerous enough that people can get seriously hurt by working on live equipment. So therefore, they restrict the use of live equipment as much as possible. So cold sequence metering takes everything through the service box first and then to the rest of the service equipment second. So we come to the service box and then to the meter and then to our panel board. This is the safest type of service because when I turn off the main service box, it makes everything else behind it dead. For residential construction, we often use what's called hot sequence metering. Hot metering is a typical way that we do residential services because we are already limited in our voltage to 300 volts from line to line, and typically we have less than a 200 amp service. Therefore, we are allowed to do hot sequence metering because the incident energy is already limited by those two factors. A hot sequence metering means that we're going to come in from the supply line, we're going to go through the meter base, and then we're going to go to our service box after that. This means that that meter base is always hot, and if the service utility company ever has to do work on it, they're going to be working on a hot device unless they disconnect it from the transformer, which again is going to be another hot device. Once we determine what kind of service we're going to do, we still need to make sure that we locate our meters in the proper location. Rule 6.408 tells us where we can and cannot put our meter bases. We need to make sure that they're located in the correct position, so when they enter the building, they're going to be close to the service box. We have to make sure that if we have multiple meter bases on the same building, they're going to be grouped together. They need to be readily accessible, which is in section 0 for definitions. They cannot be located anywhere that's dangerous or hazardous or undesirable. So if you don't want to work there, don't put the meter base there. And most importantly, they must be in compliance with the supply authority. Depending on where you're working, all the supply authority's rules can change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. For example, in Medicine Hat, we make sure that we mount the meter base on the corner closest to where the utility enters the property and within 2 meters of that corner. This makes sure the meter base doesn't go too far into the property to affect voltage drop, as well as that 2-meter rule allows for any brick molding or stone molding to go around the corner without impeding it. Also, places like Medicine Hat, Brooks, and Calgary have a rule where the center of the meter base must be within 1800 millimeters and 1500 millimeters from the finished grade. So typically speaking, we would want to place our meter within those 2 measurements from wherever the tar line is on the foundation. When we're thinking about accessibility, we also have to remember Rule 2308, which states that we have to have at least a minimum of 1 meter in front of any of our electrical equipment, and this does include our meter bases. We have to make sure that anybody who's checking on the meter base or working on the meter base has enough level, secure footing to work on it safely. So we can make sure that it's not behind any buildings or structures that's going to impede on that 1 meter rule. So that's the end of 205B Part 1. Make sure you're going through the definitions as well as the rules and regulations behind where we can put our meter bases. And check with your supply authority in your area to make sure that you know what the regulations are for that. Most of that information can be found on their website. Make sure that you review the modules up to this point, and when you're ready, continue on to Part 2.